Much of Katharine of Aragon's story is dominated by the end of her marriage to King Henry VIII, but there is so much more to this fascinating woman, and a window of her life that we seldom explore is where it all started, back in her native homeland of Spain. What was Katharine of Aragon's ancestry? How did her marriages into the English royal family come about? And how did Katharine's mother Isabella work with Henry VII to help legitimise each other's claims to their respective thrones? Well, to answer all of this and much more, in this week's podcast I welcome back historian, author and attorney Heather Darsie onto the show. Heather's latest book, Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess, which comes out next month in the UK, is the basis for our conversation, and so prepare to learn a lot about Katharine of Aragon that you did not know before. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest Podcast, episode 82, Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess, with Heather Darsie. Welcome to the Tudor Chest Podcast, Heather Darsie. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Very well. You're back for a second time. You came on before to speak all about Anna of Cleves. This time, we're jumping into the world of Henry VIII's first wife, Katharine of Aragon. You've got an upcoming book coming out, the basis really of this conversation. Before we get into that, a few questions just to get to know you a bit better for those who may not know your story all that well. So can you provide me with a short introduction into your background, where you grew up and what you now do full time? I've just been given a bit of an overview, and you do a lot.
Yes. So my name's Heather Darsie. I live by Chicago. My bachelor's degree is in German languages and literature. I also studied Spanish and French when I was at university. And since then, I have taught myself some Latin and some Italian, along with smatterings of other things that I've kind of tripped across doing research. And I have a Juris Doctorate, and I work full-time as a prosecutor. I've also worked as a defense attorney. And for non-Americans, attorneys in the United States do everything. So we review documents, we draft documents, we go to court, we present cases to juries and to judges if we're doing a bench trial. So we do a little bit of everything. And right now I'm becoming more and more specialized in traffic court, I guess you could say.
And you also find the time to write books about history as well.
I do, yeah. I mean, but I've been working at this just in general, I guess, with 16th century, first half of the 16th century history, and it's more Central European history. And so I'm very interested in Anna of Cleves, of course, and Katharine of Aragon, and some of Henry's other queens, because they have connections to Europe. Yeah. And that's kind of where the interest comes in.
Yeah. So do you have a favourite Tudor fact?
I don't know if this is a favorite Tudor fact, but I think it's interesting that they start their fiscal year on Lady Day, March 25th. I always thought that was I think it's kind of charming in a way.
And if you could go back and ask, based on today's conversation, if you could go back and ask Katharine of Aragon one question, what would it be?
I would ask her what advice she would give to her daughter Mary when Mary became queen.
Yeah, I think it's, well, the end of their relationship, and the fact that they were kept so separate, I think, is one of the crueler things that Henry VIII did. And I think, yeah, it would have been lovely for Katharine to know that Mary became queen, if only for 5 years, but nonetheless the first true queen regnant in English history. So, as I said, we're here today to talk about Katharine of Aragon, and you've written a book about her that's coming out, well, now that we are officially into April, coming out next month, and it's Katharine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. So this book, in a way, I suppose, does something that maybe a lot of books about Katharine of Aragon haven't done, at least in English-speaking language, that is, which is that it also explores very much the beginnings of Catherine's dynasty that she belongs to. As I said, I think that's a subject that many people out of Spain would know much about. So can you briefly, if possible, introduce me to the dynasty that Catherine was born to?
Yes. So I feel like it's very common to mention when we look at Henry VIII that his family's dynasty was founded somewhat as a result of the Wars of the Roses. And we even go back a little bit farther than that because we have to look at his father's Lancastrian connection. So I thought, well, where did the Trastamaras come from? So I went all the way back to where Katharine of Aragon's family was founded in the late 14th century and started there. And I can tell you that her family was very, very dramatic and very violent, which I was not expecting. And her family was founded with violence, and her family was founded through an illegitimate line, which I was not expecting. So, and my book is pretty much broken down into three parts, and the first part goes from the founding of her family's dynasty up through Catherine leaving for England.
It's interesting, isn't it, that actually, when we look back on history, how much illegitimate lines can take root. I mean, the Tudors were effectively born via an illegitimate line, and we go back even further. William the Conqueror, famously known as William the Bastard,
Yes.
before becoming William the Conqueror.
Yes. And when we look at even the behavior of Katharine of Aragon's grandparents, particularly her paternal grandparents, the behavior of Catherine's father towards her sister makes a lot more sense. So there's just all these contextual things that kind of explain Catherine's behavior or why she might have potentially had more anxiety. And unfortunately, with any of these people, they weren't keeping journals about their thoughts and feelings. So we don't truly know how Catherine was really feeling about things or how much of her family history she knew. But if she was aware of even a tiny glimmer of it, about even just her grandparents or what her, or some of the things her dad would have seen, wow.
Yeah, a lot going on.
Yes, yes, a lot going on. Yes. So, usurping, power hungry, just absolutely astounding. And I thought that the English were a little bit excessive in their grasping at the throne, but I think that the Spanish kind of outdid themselves by comparison.
Regarding Catherine's parents, I think a lot of people know the names Ferdinand and Isabella. They know them as the joint monarchs of Spain. They know them as the people who effectively brought in the Inquisition. But I think something that maybe people don't appreciate is how unusual Isabella was. So can you maybe explain what made Isabella so, what I suppose you could call unique? I mean, this was very much, she wore the trousers in this relationship, or at least that's how it's portrayed. Is that the case?
Kind of. And one thing I wanted to point out for our American listeners too is it was Isabella and Ferdinand who sent Christopher Columbus out exploring. So in America, we celebrate Columbus Day. It was that couple that sent him out exploring, and then he came and found, quote unquote, discovered the Americas. So just to kind of put him in context for our American listeners. So nice. Isabella, she was kind of the first full monarch, at least in recent medieval history, I guess you could say, of Castile and Leon. Like there had been different female leaders or female monarchs of the different territories. And I explain this a little bit better in my book. So it wasn't strange to have a female leader of the different kingdoms in Spain, but the iteration that we had when Ferdinand and Isabella existed was more consolidated. So she's the first female ruler of Castile and Leon, and those areas were much wealthier and much more powerful at that point than Aragon.
And it's Aragon that's, Ferdinand is what, he brings Aragon into the mix. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So essentially, she is the more powerful party in this couple.
Yes, and she is also the one that held the purse strings for Katharine of Aragon's dowry.
I see, okay. So that's interesting because we always, again, history written by the men, we always hear about this tasseling between Henry VII and Ferdinand over Ferdinand's daughter's dowry, but based on what you've just said, it's Isabella that's actually the person responsible here.
And then Juana.
Okay, right. Okay, we'll come to that in a bit more detail a bit later on, that is. So the fact that Isabella is a queen regnant, she's a queen militant, how much impact do you think that would have then had on the way Catherine perceived female rule?
Oh, a tremendous amount. It would have been very normal to Catherine, in addition to just simple inheritance rights in Spain. It was not strange for a Spanish woman of sufficient noble status to inherit property. And even in
Yeah.
England, there was no rules or laws of which I'm aware against a woman becoming queen. I mean, we had Empress Matilda. She never really became queen, but it wasn't right. It wasn't specifically outlawed, if you will. Whereas in France, there was a belief, although it's been shown that it was never actually on the books, that women couldn't become queens regnant. And so between her mother and her sister, I mean, it would have been outrageous to Catherine that Mary couldn't become queen in her own right of England. It would have been completely I believe that, again, because these people didn't keep journals, so we don't actually know. But I think that for Catherine, it would have been completely nonsensical. And especially by the time Catherine marries Henry, the only people left to inherit are Catherine and her sisters, because Catherine had one brother who passed away when he was a teenager. So it was just Catherine and her sister Juana. Her sister Isabella died in the late 1490s. And then they had it was Catherine's older sister Maria, who was queen in Portugal. So, I mean, it was three women. That was it. And they could all stand to inherit.
And it's Juana that's, forgive me, my knowledge isn't excellent, but Juana's the one that is known as Juana the Mad at some point?
She is known as that, yes.
So did she have mental difficulties, or what was going on?
I go on a mighty large tangent about Juana in my book.
Okay.
I don't think that she was mad or incompetent, but I think that we might recognize a different condition in her today. And I think that was taken advantage of. And I also think that she was put into some very difficult situations. I think that one thing that was very much clung to was the disposition of her husband's body, because he passes away in September, I think it was 1506. The body isn't buried for a very long time. No one was helping her bury the body.
How early on did discussions arise about Catherine marrying into the English royal family? And I just want to check, in her homeland, she was known as Catalina, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so when did discussions arise of Catalina marrying into the English royal family? And I take it that she wouldn't have been particularly consulted on this.
I think she was about 3, so is it 1488 or so?
What did that deal look like? Was it when it was being ironed out? When was she due to go over to England?
It was basic discussions at that point. Ferdinand and Isabella had their first child, who was like in the early 1470s, and they had also hoped to marry a child into the English family, one of the children of Edward IV. But of course, he then passed away, so that kind of went away. So they'd been looking to create this alliance between England and Spain for a while, and they revived it somewhat with Catalina, and they didn't really start taking off with the negotiations until the 1490s, and things weren't really shored up until the mid to late 1490s. And there was some debate between whether it would be Maria, Catherine's next closest in age sister, or if it would be Catherine herself. So it was pretty protracted. And then there was a lot of squabbling over how the dowry would be paid out, when it would be paid out, and what the terms of that were. And when they finally settled on that, unfortunately, they put in one clause that would prove to be a real source of difficulty for Catherine, given what happened during her first marriage with Arthur passing away as soon as he did. So the whole thing was quite protracted. The Spanish monarchs were very, very delayed in sending Catherine to England. That annoyed the heck out of Henry VII, because he was ready to have his Spanish princess, and they were not ready to send her. There were also issues with whether or not they were going to have a papal dispensation given the ages of Catherine and Arthur, because that would have been required. There kind of was one, there kind of wasn't. They did the betrothal ceremony, if you will, and then Catherine's parents wanted it done again once Arthur was old enough, and it was just a whole big mess. It just took forever for them to get to that point. But Henry VII and Elizabeth definitely wanted the marriage. It just took a really long time for them to finish, for everybody to finish negotiating it, and for Catherine to finally be sent to England.
Yeah, and a big part of that as well, as we understand it, was pressure from Isabella and Ferdinand to also remove senior claimants to the English throne, most notably the Earl of Warwick, Edward Earl of Warwick. Is based on what you found out, does that seem to be true?
I didn't really see that in the documents that I was looking at. I don't know that that isn't somewhere. I didn't really see that. What I was more seeing were issues
Yeah.
where Isabella and Ferdinand were becoming cozy with Maximilian von Habsburg. He was the king of the Romans and Germans. He wasn't the emperor yet because there was some lag in getting him officially crowned, and he had difficulties with Henry VII, so there was some dispute there. So that appeared to cause some delay. And then you had the whole Perkin Warbeck issue that caused some concerns for Isabella and Ferdinand. So that's more what I was seeing directly with the letters that I was reviewing and some of the documents that I was reviewing. I'm not saying that the Earl of Warwick stuff isn't in there. I don't recall seeing that or having that be of particular concern compared to the other things that I was reviewing.
Yeah. When I was doing my research, it came up as a part of the although his involvement in the escape attempt by Perkin Warbeck from the Tower was used as the official reason for his eventual execution. There had been pressure from Ferdinand and Isabella to deal with the most senior male claimant to the throne, which was the Earl of Warwick. But it's difficult to say with certainty.
And in England, they could have very well just used that as a
Yeah.
convenient excuse to off him. I mean, I didn't see anything from Ferdinand and Isabella specifically saying that I can recall. But again, I mean, if you're writing the records in England, because I assume that that's probably
Yes.
what you were looking at, that seems like a good excuse to get rid of an inconvenient person.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So you've commented that Isabella of Spain and Henry VII actually used each other to help legitimize their own reigns. So can you discuss that for me?
They were both usurpers. So when you look at Henry VII, he won the crown by right of conquest. He came in, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. He did have a claim to it, but he still took it through military conquest, through defeat. Isabella's niece was the legitimate heir of her father, although there's some back and forth there, but you can read about that in the book. She usurped her niece. So neither one of them, neither Henry VII nor Isabella, were the actual incumbent heir, if you will, to the throne. They used military tactics and a little bit of propaganda, I would say, to gain their position.
So how did they then support each other to help legitimize themselves?
Marry their children together. I mean, it's as simple as that. They're recognizing the legitimacy of their children. Also, when we look at Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage, they had issues of consanguinity. They were too closely related, and a fake papal dispensation was created to allow them to marry.
A fake one. Wowzers. Okay. You briefly touched on the dowry a moment ago, and we'll come to the clause around the clause that caused complexities a bit later on. But what was involved in the dowry? Is it money and lands, or is it purely money? It's just money.
It's money. So from Isabella and Ferdinand, it was payment of
Okay.
money. And some of it was supposed to be done in the valuation of plate and other jewels. And part of the issue was that they didn't agree on the value of the plate and jewels before they were sent to England. And so Henry was allowed to. The one thing he did that was kind of dirty was he was allowed to play around with the value of the plate and the jewels so he could undervalue them. So they did not agree on a value of the items before they were sent into England.
Okay, so the goods arrived and he was like, yeah, that's not worth what they're claiming, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one thing he was allowed to play around. So he did, I did think that was a little bit dirty, but I don't think he's as terrible as everybody likes to make him out to be.
A facet of Catherine's story that a lot of people may not know is her strong English heritage. Heritage that actually made her a claimant to the English throne, and moreover, a claim that was technically senior to the Tudors. So, can you explain this claim to me? Do you know? Can you recall how she was tied in?
Yes. So, I believe this is better explained in some family trees that I have in my book, so forgive me if I misspeak. But you have Pedro or Peter the Cruel, King of Castile. He is killed by his half-brother, Henry the Fratricidal, who then becomes the founder of the Trastamara dynasty. Pedro of Castile has two daughters, including Catherine of Castile, I believe was her name. She marries John of Gaunt. They have Catherine of Lancaster. Catherine of Lancaster marries one of Henry of Castile's sons. They have children together. Katharine of Aragon is the descendant of one of those children. Additionally, Katharine of Aragon is related, and this is in my book, but I don't remember how, but she's also related to Elizabeth of York.
Okay, I'll have to.
So there's a couple things there, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of lines there, and based on that marriage, it also sounds like it's a legitimate line as well, whereas
Yes.
the Tudors are famously via an illegitimate line, which I suppose is what makes it senior to their Catherine's claim senior to the claim of the Tudors.
Yes. Yeah, it's legitimate all the way down. Yes. So even though Catherine's family dynasty was founded through an illegitimate person, the line between the founder of her family dynasty and Catherine is legitimate. So, and that would include Catherine of Lancaster.
Catherine of, there's all this toing and throwing between Henry VII, Catherine's parents. She finally does arrive in England. What immediate impact did she have on the culture of the court, I suppose? Do we know, did things take on a bit of a Spanish edge? Or was Catherine sort of fully absorbed into the Tudor world?
Fashion. So she wore farthingale skirts. So those are the skirts with the big wooden hoops that kind of give that bell shape. That seemed to be the most immediate thing. Beyond that, it's a little difficult to tell. She seemed to kind of keep to herself a lot the first several years that she was there. And it's hard to tell how much English she knew before 1509. In some letters, there's a letter she wrote when she was in her limbo between 1502 and 1509 to her father, where she was asking to have a Spanish confessor or Spanish priest sent to England to act as her confessor. And she's saying that she can't really speak English. And we have to figure out, is she telling the truth or is she an upset teenager?
Yes. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So I don't know. And sometimes, though, too, when we're dealing with serious things, was she just more comfortable with having someone who spoke Spanish because she's a native Spanish speaker? So we don't really know. And she would have been at court, but she might not have been popular at court because she didn't really have a position at court. So the biggest thing we can really see is the farthingale skirts. And I'm not saying she didn't have other influences, but by the time she becomes queen with Henry, she'd already been in England for 7 years. She really didn't have a whole lot of access to Spanish cultural things. So as far as dress and such goes, my assumption would be that she really only had access to English dress and English style things and English tailors. So there would be a lot less of a Spanish influence. We know she brought in the black work embroidery as well. So there was definitely influence there. I just don't know how extensive it would have been.
So obviously Catherine's marriage to Prince Arthur is famously short. It lasts just 5 months before the prince dies, aged just 15. I have to ask the question, but I know that you've got thoughts on this, which is around whether their marriage was consummated or not.
So I'm going to give you the legal answer, and then I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit. So legally speaking, yes, it was consummated. There was a consummation type ceremony or bedding after their wedding ceremony. So legally it was consummated. Also, in the papal dispensation for Catherine to marry Henry, it pretty much said whether or not Catherine and Arthur consummated the marriage, Henry and Catherine can marry as though she hadn't consummated it. Regardless of whether Catherine and Arthur did, they dispensation they had not. There was proof from someone within Catherine's household that was sent back to Spain that Catherine and Arthur had not. So those are all the legal things. I'm now going to get on my soapbox. Brace yourselves. So I think that sometimes we forget that when we're talking about Katharine of Aragon or any of the other wives or Henry VIII, that these were real people who lived, breathed, loved, cried, hated, died. I think it's really kind of strange and creepy to fixate on the sex lives of 15-year-olds. I know that if I were to go to work today and talk about, I don't know, my coworker's 15-year-old and whether they were having sex with a 15-year-old boyfriend or girlfriend, that would be really creepy and weird. So I don't like to speculate on whether or not they had sex because for legal purposes, they consummated the marriage, and also for legal purposes, they hadn't consummated the marriage. I'm just going to leave it at that. I think it's weird that we fixate on whether or not teenagers had sex. I think that's weird. So that's kind of my answer. So legally speaking, they had a ceremony after their wedding, and then the Pope gave a dispensation so that Catherine and Henry could marry, and the children could be born without blemish, I guess you could say. And I would like to move forward. I hope that as a society we can move forward without talking about did they or didn't they, because it's a little weird.
Yeah, I suppose the difficulty is that it wasn't weird for them. So it's kind of, and I suppose that the reason I think we obsess over this, and it is weird. I mean, we're talking about teenagers here, but I suppose what it comes also down to is that inherent who was telling the truth here in the grand scheme of things. If Catherine, if they did, then Catherine lied later on. Now, I don't believe they did. I think she was telling the truth, but I think that's why there's this eternal desire to discuss it, because ultimately, I think as lovers of history, as historians, we're always searching for the truth of the matter. And even if it's an unsavory subject, I think that's why people drag it up a lot. But I totally get your point that it's a bit weird that we wouldn't be having that. I mean, you certainly wouldn't have that conversation about a member of the royal family who's a teenager at in this day and age, would you? So,
well, but here's an interesting thing, though, that I think Henry learned from having his farce of a trial with Katharine of Aragon that he changed for his trials with, definitely for his trial with Anna of Cleves, is that the testimony, and actually with his trial with Anne Boleyn too, the testimony of a lady's female servants was given much more weight when it surrounded things like consummation, childbirth, etc., than a man's male servants. Because the female servants would be involved with changing the bedding, would see the woman's body, et cetera, et cetera. And when we look at the events at Blackfriars, it was only Arthur's male servants that were present. And then when we look at what happened with Anne Boleyn, it was someone close to her that accused her of her behaviors. When we look at Anna of Cleves, well, it wasn't even really a trial. It was a convocation. It was members of her household. So what was interesting was Henry got better at presenting evidence against the women. And that became more trustworthy evidence. So he got better at presenting cases as time went on. But I mean, ultimately too, I guess it's fun to play the what if game, but we can't go back and change anything. So we just have to deal with the past as it is. We can't change it.
Yeah, absolutely. So you touched a moment ago on the Spanish fashions impacting Catherine in the early days of her time in England. But how much impact did her Spanish heritage, I suppose, inform her early tenure as queen, as best we can tell?
From what I am aware of about Catherine, she grew up in a very cultured place. Like Spain was very, very cultured. There was some commentary that Catherine needed to be sent to England as young as possible so that she did not become too accustomed to the ways of Spain, because in the ambassador's opinion, Spain was better to really just kind of truncate it. And I don't know if that was just based on pure nationalism or if it was because of the arts and everything that was present in Spain. Catherine,
Nicer weather.
what's that?
Nicer weather.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, much different weather, right? Like it's much warmer there. And today, the weather might be arguably a bit nicer than in England. But although I would say that English weather is nicer compared to London weather is nicer compared to Chicago weather. I love going to London in January because I can go outside with wet hair and my hair doesn't freeze. I cannot do that where I live in Chicago. And my friends look at me like I'm nuts because I will go for walks outside in January in London and think it's lovely. So for Catherine, yes, same thing, economy of scale, I guess. But so the English court was a lot different than the Spanish court. She would have been exposed to, I think, a greater variety of things. She would have had some Islamic influence with architecture, not necessarily Islamic as a cultural thing and not necessarily religious. But we have to remember that Islamic culture, and I'm using that to kind of generalize the Islamic/Arabic world, and maybe that's not the best way for me to do it, but unfortunately that's what I'm doing for purposes of this podcast. They were engaging in trade. They had hegemony over trade in that area of the world before, during the part of the medieval period. So she would have had access to a lot of things that just weren't in England, and she would have brought some of that information, influence with her to England. She was very interested in the arts. She was very interested in just learning and in books and things like that. So she would have brought those mental characteristics and curiosity with her to England. And I think that she was able to explore that much more after she became queen. That might have been limited when she was in limbo between 1502 and 1509.
And I'll come back to that in a second. But that reference about Arabic influence, I think that is kind of the perfect example of that. I think is to look at the Alhambra Palace in Spain. There is a real, because that's Catherine spent a lot of time there, right?
Yeah, she would have spent some time there. Granada, that was a major Islamic city that her parents defeated, or conquered, I should say. So she would have been exposed to these things. There was the Nasrid dynasty that her parents defeated. There was the Nasrid library, which unfortunately they burned almost all the books that were contained in it, except for the medical books. And I guess a handful of others. But there would have been a completely different type of medicine. There might have been even more advanced medicine because of again, I'm going to use the term Islamic influence. They would have potentially had more advanced medical practices in Spain because they had access to these books from invading and conquering the last Islamic hold on the Iberian Peninsula and taking those books from that library, having access to those books. So there were tons of things that were just present on the Iberian Peninsula to such a large degree that weren't available in England.
Yeah, and if you look at somewhere like the Alhambra Palace, it has there is a massive Arabic influence just to the architecture and the way it looks. So I think that definitely makes sense. So following the death of Prince Arthur, certainly as it's portrayed to us, is that Henry VII keeps Catherine all but destitute. Now, destitute relative to peasants in Tudor England, there's a massive difference here. She's still a princess of Spain. But what was driving this? Surely he knew that this would get back to Catherine's parents, and I suppose this is the appropriate time to then discuss the dowry and the complexities therein. So what was going on here?
I'm going to give you the broad strokes because I go into this in much more detail in my book, but there's a confluence of events. Things are going really, 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 really wrong in Spain. Very wrong in Spain. Also, Arthur's deceased. Isabella dies. Juana is not in Spain. She's having babies in the Netherlands. No one's really in control of the treasury. Ferdinand doesn't have control of the treasury. And because of the clause relating to the dowry, in theory, any money that Ferdinand sends into England could be taken as payment of the dowry. And the way that the contract is written, could any money could be that is taken as evidence of paying the dowry could be used against Catherine. And we'll leave it at that. So it's not just Henry VII and Ferdinand II being jerks. Like there's very, very complicated things going on in the background. Very complicated things. And unfortunately for Catherine, she suffered for it. And it's sad what happened to her. I think that she was toyed with for sure, because there was also this idea of marrying her to Henry, Prince of Wales, who became Henry VIII. Nobody really took quick movement on that, but also Henry VIII, the future Henry VIII, was very young. There were some difficulties, again, with Isabella dying. Ferdinand was distracted with other things, particularly because Isabella died, trying to figure out what to do with Castile and Leon, trying to figure out what to do with Juana. A whole bunch of things were going wrong in Spain. And Catherine, because of the complications with the clauses in the dowry contract between England and Spain, and the issues within Spain, and waiting on dispensation so that Catherine could marry Henry, the Prince of Wales, soon to be Henry VIII, she kind of just got stuck in England. There were some overtures to move her back to Spain, but nothing ever really came of it.
Okay, so what was that particular clause within the dowry that causes such issues?
You're gonna have to read the book.
I thought you might say that.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
But
So,
I promise it all makes sense. But there were a lot of really, and it's not just this, but there's a lot of bad things happening in Spain, and a lot of complicated things that happened within about a year and a half of Arthur passing away that kind of kick off everything. And then it just really goes downhill, particularly from about 1504 to 1506. And then I don't know that there was really good excuse between, well, no, actually, it just kind of all is pretty terrible. Yeah, it was a really bad time for Catherine.
yeah, okay. So one of the first things Henry VIII does when he becomes king is to marry Catherine. And I'm curious to know, based on what you've learned and the research you've done, is whether you think this was genuine love between Henry and Catherine, or maybe you touched on the fact that Henry is younger than Catherine. He's 17 at the point they marry. She's 22, 23. Do you think there was genuine love, or do you think on Henry's part it's maybe more of it like a youthful crush? Just curious to know your feelings.
I think it might have been a little bit of all of it. I think that for Catherine would have been beautiful and 22, and she would have had her adult figure, and Henry would have been cute and 17 and tall and handsome and athletic, and he would have been rescuing this beleaguered princess who was beautiful and articulate and from Spain and a little exotic, and he'd be saving her, and Catherine was finally fulfilling her duty and becoming queen, and this cute guy was king and he's going to save her. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit of all of it. And I don't really see any reason why they would have disliked each other. They would have had opportunities to get to know each other. They would have spent 7-8 years getting to know each other kind of from afar in some instances. And I don't see why they would not have loved each other. But I think there's definitely, I can see how there'd be a romantic element to it, right? Because they're kind of, it's the knight in shining armor type thing. So Henry has this very big chivalric, romantic event where he gets to rescue his princess, and she gets to be rescued, and she gets to have her happy ending and stuff. So I think that they very much could have been in love, and I think they could have been in love for a long time. And this might go against popular opinion. I think he loved her until she died, and I think he respected her and cared for her. I just don't think he could be married to her anymore because he needed to have, in his opinion, boys. But I don't think he ever didn't love her. He just couldn't be married to her anymore. That doesn't mean he didn't love or have the hots for Anne Boleyn. There's different... This is a bit of a tangent. There's a great book by C.S. Lewis called The Four Loves, and it discusses the different types of love. And there's romantic love, there's friendship love, charitable love and another type of love. I think he did love her deeply, maybe not romantically anymore by the time Anne Boleyn came on the scene, but I think he did love her quite a bit. And when he married her, yeah, I think there was definitely a crush and a love and a passion element and a romantic element. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that with Henry and Catherine as well, I think that there would have been that just when you've been with someone that long, there's always going to be an element of love there. And I actually also I think that in many ways, as much as we think of Henry VIII as being this quite unconventional figure because of how many times he marries, I actually think that, to your point about he loved, you think he did have affection and love for Catherine right to her dying day. I actually think that by the time he marries Anne Boleyn, what he's looking for really is Katharine of Aragon 2.0,
Oh
but,
yeah.
but one younger and more fertile.
Oh yeah.
That Anne Boleyn, the woman, the person that she was, by the point he marries her, is kind of irrelevant. It's
Yeah.
he wants Catherine again, but younger, compliant, and fertile,
Yeah.
basically.
I don't think he didn't mean to get married 6 times. I mean, when we really look at it, and of course, some of this is my opinion from my research and the books I've written, but
Yeah,
he meant to marry Catherine of Aragon. He never knew that he was going to not have healthy boys with her. Let's say surviving boys with her. He needed to break away from the Catholic Church. That was going to happen at some point in history regardless. And I go into that a bit more, actually, a little bit in my Catherine of Aragon book, and then a lot more in my Anne Boleyn book, which comes out later this year, and we can talk about that when the time comes. But I don't think he expected Anne Boleyn to turn out the way that she did. He probably did not marry Anne Boleyn thinking, oh no, bad things are going to happen and I will have to behead her. He didn't think Jane Seymour was going to die. He didn't think that Anna of Cleves' brother was going to go behind his back and try to rope him into an international war such that he had to have the marriage annulled and hurry up and marry wife number 5 so that no one could force him to take back Anna of Cleves. He did not know that poor Catherine Howard was not a virgin and all the other probably true but unfortunate things of which she was accused that are just absolutely terrible reasons, but enough reasons back then for her to be executed. Very tragic. And he did not know, again, that there was going to be the Cleves War and that Anna's brother Wilhelm was going to try and get Henry to marry Anna again to renew the alliance. So instead, he marries Catherine Parr just to remove himself from the equation so that he doesn't have to side with the emperor and he doesn't have to side with Cleves. He didn't mean to get married 6 times. And it's so easy for us to sit here and be like, oh, he
yeah,
was such a psychopath. He married 6 women.
yeah.
He didn't plan on that. He didn't plan on it.
Yeah, yeah. He didn't go into each marriage thinking this is going to be one of
No.
many. He went into each marriage hoping that this would be the woman he dies beside.
Yeah. And I think, frankly, after Jane Seymour, I think he'd had enough. And I mean, the last 3 marriages were much more politically motivated. Actually, all 3 of them were politically motivated.
So I know that you're a Spanish speaker, so that will have obviously been enormously helpful when exploring the contemporary records. And one resource that I know you examined was something known as the Receipt of Lady Catherine. So what is this, and is there any new information
Yes.
that you're able to discover in that you're happy to discuss before the book comes out?
Yeah. So the Receipt of Lady Catherine is kind of like a festival book or a tournament book, and those things were very popular around that time period. Usually they're illustrated, especially if it's a tournament book, so you'd have these fabulous images of jousts and things like that. And this book discusses Catherine's arrival in England, and so I was able to put a bit more detail in that. And I do heavily quote from the Receipt of Lady Catherine because it talks about her entry into England, gives a lot of rich detail about all the pageants that she experienced. So I have heavy quoting from that, and I do put it into modern English because the English from the time period can be extremely difficult to read.
Yeah.
Some of the words that they use are just not words that we have in modern English. So I do heavily borrow. I do heavily quote that just because I wanted people to really be able to appreciate what was going on. So I do have a rather long chapter about her entry into England, or excuse me, into London, and all the things she would have seen and experienced. And then it describes her wedding in detail to Prince Arthur and the banqueting afterwards. And well, I should say feasting because banqueting is dessert, but there was some banqueting. And then also her bedding ceremony. And these things have been discussed in books before. They've been mentioned in books before, but I spent a lot of time transcribing into modern English exactly what was going on so that we could hopefully appreciate it a little bit more.
Amazing. Well, I look forward to finding all of that juicy detail out, because those are the things that I think also really help us bring the history back to life in many respects.
Yeah. And I gave the pageants don't really, some of the pageants don't really have names. So some of them had names, which I put in my book. And then there was at least one that I can think of that didn't have a name. So I named the pageant. But yeah, it was really fun. It was neat to read this festival book and to know what she would have seen. And some of the things she wasn't present for, she might have been resting, but Elizabeth of York was there and Henry VII was there, so you got to find out what they saw and what they did. So, and frankly, if anyone wants to take on reading the Receipt of Lady Catherine, you should be able to get it at a library or find it online, or find a used copy online that you can purchase. And it will hurt your brain a little bit getting used to the English, but is absolutely worth it if you want to take it on. It's really, really fascinating.
Amazing. So, see, we all know that the royal marriage does eventually break down, thanks in no small part to a certain Anne Boleyn. Now, something that I, and probably most fans of history, don't truly appreciate is actually what's going on and the much wider impact the separation between Henry and Catherine has across Europe. And with this, I'm referring to the Habsburg and Trastamara dynasties. So can you discuss this for me in a bit more detail? What's going on here? Or at least what can you tell me without massively spoiling lots of the book?
Well, overall, there's the danger that if there's a couple different things going on. So first of all, Henry is not the first English king to try and limit or undermine papal authority in England. Just nobody thought about it for 150 years. So he revives a lot of those things. I don't really go into that in this book, but you can read about it in my Anne Boleyn book. That's going to come out later. And there were some, I guess, laws you could say that were created and then reiterated by various popes. One of them in 1509 that prevented appeals of papal decisions. And of course, the dispensation for Katharine of Aragon to marry Henry VIII was a papal decision. So if you were to undo a papal decision just for Henry VIII,
Okay.
that's a lot of papal decisions that could then be appealed and get undone.
Yeah, it's setting a bit of a dangerous precedent, isn't it?
Yeah, and when you look at the Habsburgs and the Trastamaras, as I do in my book, that might make them a little nervous.
So my final question for you then, again, if you're able to say, is was there something that came up in the research that sort of really blindsided you and took you by surprise?
I think everything going on in Spain when she was in England, I think that really, well, I suppose, so I'm sorry, I'm speaking in half sentences. When I was structuring the book, I was not expecting to spend so much time just on the part of her life between 1502 and 1509. So that's part 2. Part 3 of the book is the shortest part of the book, and that covers her queenship with Henry VIII. And most people, I think, spend a lot of time on that part of her life. And on the Great Matter, I spend very little time on that part of her life because we all know what happened there. And I just kind of go back and compare or bring up connections from her heritage and what happened to her when she was younger with what was going on during her queenship. I was very surprised to find out more logical reasons for why she was treated the way she was by Henry VII and also by Ferdinand II. And it was the combination of how the marital contract was written and thinking that through, because it's very difficult to find the smoking gun in historical documents. No one's going to say, well, we can't do this because of this. But when you sit back and think about it, it's like, oh, this seems reasonable why these people behave this way. And then also when you're looking at all the genuinely terrible things that were happening in Spain that just left Catherine as kind of an afterthought for her father and also for her sister, quite frankly. Her sister Juana wasn't really doing a whole lot to help her.
Yeah, because you said that it was Juana who was responsible for actually sending the dowry payments?
In the sense that after Isabella passed away, it was Juana who was then the monarch and who would have in theory been in control of the Castilian treasury.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I'm really looking forward to with this book, is to dig into this window. As a Brit, all I'm taught, growing up, what we're taught is there is this window where she's just knocking about a ever decrepit palace, shunned by Henry VII, who's just being mean and not giving her the money she's owed. But based on what you've just said, there is so much more going on here that actually, I suppose, at least makes sense of some of why Henry VII behaved the way he did.
Yeah. And for why Ferdinand behaved the way that he did. I'm not saying that either of them were right in their behavior, but I think, again, let's have some context. So I hope that part of what I've done is provided some context for the behavior. Again, it's not in an effort to justify, but to help it make sense. And I think that with what I found, it was surprising, but particularly not just what was going on at the Spanish court, but overall what was happening in Spain has helped me understand more about why Catherine was being treated the way she was by her father and by a little bit by her mother, but her mother passed away kind of early on, and also maybe by her sister.
I see. Well, I cannot wait to read it and to learn more about this window of Catherine's life that we think we know what was going on, but actually, based on what you've just said, there is a whole lot more behind this. So, for people who want to keep up to date with what you're doing, where can they find you on social media? So,
I have Heather R. Darsie Historian on Facebook. I have Heather Darsie Historian on Instagram because I forgot my middle initial. And then I have @HR Darsie History on Twitter. I also have Blue Sky, and I admit I don't really remember my handle on that, but there's an H Darsie in all of these things. But I'm on Twitter. I guess it's X. Excuse me. I have X.
Yeah, I've yet to do the Blue Sky thing. Everyone tells me they're on Blue Sky. I'm like, I've yet to do it.
I have it, and I have to tell you. So I'm on Instagram. I'm on X. I'm on Threads. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Blue Sky. I've been terrible about updating recently because I've been trying to finish up my Anne Boleyn book. So I finished Katharine of Aragon. I'm now finishing up Anne Boleyn, so I'm a very busy Heather B. And so I'm not trying to ignore all of you. I'm just in that. If you want to contact me, another thing you can do is I have my website, maidensandmanuscripts.com. I'm hoping to post more articles on there after I finish my Anne Boleyn book. But like I said, I have 3 books coming out in 14 months. I had one come out in October. I've got one coming out in May and one coming out in December. So I'm sorry for not posting on my blog or other stuff more often. I've just been very busy. But I'm sure you'll all forgive me.
Very busy.
Yeah, I'm going to calm down after this one. There's more books coming, but just going to calm down a little bit. Post-pandemic catch-up.
I was going to briefly ask you about the Anne Boleyn book. So what can you tell us about your Anne Boleyn book? Because based on what you've told me, it's going to be quite interesting.
Well, so I wanted to figure out what I've learned, and what I hope is obvious to everyone, is that we have the documents that Henry and his court left to posterity about why people got dead or why he did things he did. So this is why the marriage to Anna of Cleves was annulled. And here's why Anne Boleyn had to die. And here's why this happened or that happened. Some of it's crap. Some of it's lies, right? Or we were just talking about the Earl of Warwick, right? Like you were talking about, it says in those documents that Isabella and Ferdinand wanted him removed, if you will. But I didn't see that anywhere. But that's a really
Yeah.
great reason for the English court or for the English monarch to have that. Maybe they made that up. So, I'm an attorney. I've worked as both a prosecutor and a defense attorney.
Mm.
I am reviewing Anne Boleyn's trial records, and I'm reviewing all the different laws that were in place during Anne Boleyn's rise, so from 1526 up to when she was executed. And I am reviewing just whatever documents we have that pertain to her, and I'm seeing what really happened, in my opinion. And that is what my book is about.
Oh, so juicy. I can't wait. It's going to be very
I
interesting.
I hope so. And I mean, it's one of those things where, again, my goal isn't to change the way we view history. It's to augment the way we view history. With what I did with Anna of Cleves, it doesn't change that Henry had the annulment. It just changes the way that we look at it. Like, why did he have the annulment? Okay, we know he said that she was ugly, but he didn't actually say that. He said that he didn't find her attractive as a basis for not consummating the marriage so he could have an annulment. So we have to have it in the proper context. Why would he want the marriage annulled? Well, he didn't want to get dragged into an international war that happened 3 years later anyway. Makes a lot more sense. With Catherine of
Yeah.
Aragon, why was she trapped in England in such terrible circumstances for 7 years? Was it because Henry VII was a mean, mean guy and her dad hated her? No. Not saying they were great guys, but there's a lot more context. So with Anne Boleyn, did she have to get dead? It
Yeah.
seems that way. Was it just because she didn't have a baby boy? No, there were other things happening, and unfortunately, she contributed to those things. So that's what I'm looking at, and that's what I'm writing about. So, and it doesn't change what happened, but it hopefully will augment our overall view of how she lived, how she conducted herself, and ultimately why she suffered the unfortunate fate that she suffered.
I see. Well, I think that is going to be an extremely exciting read, and I really look forward to it. And the book about Catherine. So the Katharine of Aragon book comes out in May.
Yes, it comes out May 15th in the UK, and I believe it comes out in August in the US. If you live in the United States, you can order it from UK Amazon, but you have to pay shipping. But I believe Blackwell's in the UK does free shipping to the United States if you don't want to wait.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming back onto the podcast for a chat about Catherine and your book, and we'll hopefully speak again soon.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you for having me again.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and my thanks to Heather Darsie for coming onto the show again this week. Next week, I'm pleased to be welcoming historian David Lee onto the show. David will be joining me for a discussion all about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth I and the French Duke of Anjou, the man that she came perhaps the closest to actually marrying. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.